Okay, let me introduce you then to today's evening. As usual, quickly announcements that we have, and then we have someone who's going to speak very briefly to you, Rob Robinson, who's standing to my left, that I'll introduce in a minute. These evenings are brought to you by three institutions working together. The Judson Memorial Church, in which you are currently seated, thanks to the minister here who thinks that these evenings are part of the mission of this church, which tells you something about this church, which you might want to know. It's one of the oldest churches in New York City. It's been here on Washington Square for, 100 years or 200 years or whatever it is. There's a nice symbolism about doing this here. The second is the Left Forum, which is an annual gathering of activists and academics on the left, and that's what Rob is going to be talking to you about in a couple minutes. And the third one is Democracy at Work. That's the institution that I work with that produces the economic update that some of you listen to on BAI or watch on Free Speech TV. So those are the three organizations that come to you. Here, and then the announcements for today. This last year, we've published two books. One is called Understanding Marxism, which is out of the table there, and the new one, just published last month, is Understanding Socialism, which is also for sale on the table outside. It is an attempt to answer questions based on right now, here in the United States, what's in people's minds about socialism, now that Bernie is running as a socialist, now that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is an extraordinarily successful political activist in a very short time because of the interest in socialism that she has tapped into and that she exemplifies in such a striking way. We get loads of questions. You have asked me questions. So this is my attempt to write an easy, quick introduction that you can use in a classroom, that you can use for yourself, that you can give to your grandmother, whatever it is that you might be interested in doing with it. And for those of you that watch this, because we are very proud that you are here tonight as a live audience, but this is viewed now, on an average, over 200,000 around the world. It's all over. We started years ago, a very small group of about 10 people in what used to be called the Brecht Forum over on the Hudson River there. And so we really have come a long way, but it is really less about what we do and more about the very interest in socialism that carries Bernie or carries Ocasio-Cortez and so on. So if you're watching, you can't be here tonight to get a copy, obviously, but you just go to our publisher. Very simple, Lulu, L-U-L-U, lulu.com, and either put my name or Democracy at Work, lulu.com/ either my name or Democracy at Work, and you can order these books very quickly. They come, and they're not expensive. I don't know, $25 or something like that. So that number two, we now have a store with all kinds of goodies, tote bags, shirts. If you want to have socialism or things like that all over your chest, we can help you in that regard. You just go to our website, which is democracyatwork.info, and there's a thing there for store. Click on that, and you can see. And please, those of you watching, do it. The third thing is very important to us. There is this entity, some of you know, called Patreon, P-A-T-R-E-O-N. And Patreon, we're part of that, and Patreon is a way for people who want to be supportive of what we're doing, having these regular evenings, producing books and producing the radio and television show, to give us some money to help us do it. And for as little as $3 a month, you can become a member of the Patreon community that supports us. And you get then all kinds of things that we produce automatically sent to you, including some that are not open to the public or only made public later on, but you would get them sooner. So all you do is you go to patreon.com, P-A-T-R-E-O-N, and click on GCLEU. That's what these evenings are called. Global Capitalism, Live Economic Update, GCLEU, and that way you can support us. We will be enormously grateful, and that helps pay for the video being done in the back of the room for this, et cetera, et cetera. A month from now, there'll be a special evening here with Dr. Harriet Fraud, a local New York psychotherapist, and a radio personality some of you may know, Juliana Forlano. She had a program on BAI and so on. And they will be talking about capitalism, family life, intimacy, a whole set of issues that are part of what they do. And if you're interested, then it'll be right in this room the second Wednesday evening in the month of February. Last item. Some of you know what Reddit is, I assume, and Reddit has this thing called Ask Me Anything. And that's what I'm going to be doing this coming Monday, January 13th, from 3 to 5 in the afternoon. The subreddit is called Late Stage Capitalism. And so the way it works is people send in questions and I produce answers as fast as I can for 2 hours. If you're at all interested in watching that back and forth or participating, just go to Reddit this Monday from 3 to 5. I've asked Rob to come and tell you a little bit about the Left Forum, one of the 3 sponsors, because they're gearing up for their Left Forum 2020 that many of you, I think, know about and will come to, and Rob will say a few words before we get into the program.
Thanks, Rick. So good evening, everyone. As Rick said, my name is Rob Robinson. I'm a longtime member of the Board of Directors of Left Forum. We're excited to tell you that this year's conference will be held May 29th through the 31st at Long Island University's downtown Brooklyn campus. We're excited about the space. Our first time being there was last year, and we received some good responses about the space. So we're reaching out to make it a long-term arrangement. We're working on that. Hopefully we'll be there for the foreseeable future. This year's conference theme is socialism, as you've heard the professor talking about. We're going to carry that message through Left Forum, and we hope to plug into that in real ways at Left Forum. Left Forum has been known to have some dynamic speakers. People in the past have included Noam Chomsky, Cornel West, Angela Davis, Dr. David Harvey. We've had a variety of different folks come and speak at the conference on plenaries. We will have a Friday night plenary and a Saturday night plenary, a little bit different this year. We will not have a Sunday plenary. We kind of assessed that it was too long, 3 days in a row, so we're kind of shortening the window there. We're also putting out a call for volunteers. Left Forum is not a capitalist organization, it's a not-for-profit. I should be careful about identifying myself with the board of directors since the professor criticized boards of directors, right? But I'll just qualify that by saying it's a not-for-profit organization. Right? Workers' board. There you go. And it's worker-driven corporate responsibility, right? But we rely on volunteers, and anywhere from youth to elders, we don't push anybody away. We need all the help that we can get. If any of you here are university professors, we've had some of our greatest responses from volunteers from NYU, the CUNY Graduate Center, the New School, Columbia University's Law School. These are places where we have some strong relationships with, and we will send out notices probably around January 15th. I'm looking for volunteers. If you're interested in volunteering or you want to know more information, you can email leftforum@leftforum.org. Very simple, leftforum@leftforum.org. Our website is www.leftforum.org. It is under construction right now. The other exciting thing is we're redoing our website, so we're in the process of making some changes there. So if you go out to the site before January 15th, it's going to give you an under construction message, but as of January 15th, it'll be live. I'll wrap up by saying the Left Forum needs to be more than a conference, and this is something that we've realized for years. So we're reaching out to put together sort of an education project. That is called the Center for Critical Thought. You'll hear more about that tonight, and some of the partners involved. Democracy at Work is a partner. The Marxist Education Project is a partner. But you will hear more about that at the end of this program. I will be around for the remainder of the evening. If you have questions about Left Forum, I'll remain until the crowd is out tonight. Thank you for your time.
Rob, does everybody have a leaflet? Many of you got the announcement. You know what the major topics are. I want to do, as I usually do, a few smaller items that you may not have paid attention to since last we met that have to do with economics and with global capitalism in a variety of ways. I do have to begin admitting that Mr. Trump has upstaged me a bit for this evening. And so it's only fair that I acknowledge his contribution and say a few words about the economics of what happened there, okay? So, and I'm relying here on the European press, which for other reasons I read every day. It's easily done with the internet, by the way. You can all do it. Most major new European papers publish an English edition if you don't speak the language or read the languages. It'll give you a perspective on what's going on in the world you cannot get here, or at least it's very, very difficult. So what I'm about to tell you relies on that. The decision to assassinate a general in the Iranian military is also to be understood as a decision to assassinate a person who had a diplomatic passport. Under the rules of the world we live in, if you have a diplomatic passport, you cannot be arrested for anything. Some of you know that here in New York City is a continual problem because the diplomats don't pay their parking tickets. And they park wherever they want, and the New York police get upset, but they can't do anything because they have what's called diplomatic immunity. So we didn't obviously give this general a ticket, and we obviously didn't give this general an arrest. We just killed him, which strikes much of the world as an extraordinary act. If you remember that we are not at war with this country, and there is no military engagement that either side has entered into against the other, it becomes even more extraordinary. But I don't want to talk so much about that. I want to talk about the economics of it. What did it achieve? Well, it doesn't change anything on the ground. Nothing changes in Iran by killing a general. Really, nothing. Nothing changes on the military situation. He's replaced by the assistant general who replaces him, as would happen anywhere. But there were some things that clearly have economic effects over the long haul. Number one, Iran, which like any modern society is full of disagreements and arguments and political, they all united. Nobody disagrees that this was horrible. And whoever is in charge in Iran now has a solidarity for the economic changes they want to make and the political changes and the international changes that they did not have before. Mr. Trump provided the unity behind the government of Iran that it could not have done for itself. If you didn't understand that, you might have missed the most remarkable immediate effect. And that took place in Iraq, which is technically where the assassination happened, at the airport in Iraq. The parliament of Iraq, let's remember, the United States invaded Iraq back in 2003. The United States has operated, owned, and occupied that country for the last 17 years, during which nothing could happen that the American authorities, occupation, did not countenance or allow. And that was time it was thought necessary to make this country an ally of the United States. And so it was doubly remarkable that in the first act that parliament in Iraq could take after the assassination of that general was to vote overwhelmingly to expel all American troops from Iraq. If you didn't notice that, go read the papers, you'll find it. It's there. It kind of buried, but it's there. That's an extraordinary achievement. After 17 years, tens of thousands of dead people, an estimated $1 trillion of your money paying for all of that. And what they did was they off the general, and they got a unanimity of hostility in a country we've occupied for 17 years. If you performed like that in a classroom in an American university, you'd get a real big F. You flunked, you failed. And I would urge you to understand that killing that general was an attempt to distract us from the failure that that whole operation was and is, by having a grandiose act at the end that could get a lot of attention, particularly from teenagers who think they're living in a comic book anyway, and for whom this kind of an event seems deeply significant. It's a symbol. What it ought to remind you of are those scenes in countless Western movies when the sheriff has once again failed to prevent a bank robbery. And as the outlaws are riding out of town with all the money that they took from the bank, and the sheriff is looking as stupid as he is, he turns to his deputy and says, "Round up the usual suspects," so he can look to be doing something. The Iraq War is a failure. By the way, let me tell you, that's a quote. And you know who it's a quote from? Donald Trump as candidate. The Iraq War is a failure. He blamed Obama. He blamed Obama for everything. He blamed him for that too. It's a failure. Wars are terrible. It's a waste. That's Mr. Trump. There was a wonderful video of Mr. Trump, and I believe it was in 2011, no, 2016, attacking Obama for threatening a war with Iran on the grounds that Obama was just using that to help him get elected. It's a wonderful video because Mr. Trump is denouncing Mr. Obama for what Mr. Trump is doing. You don't need anybody else. But in the euphoria that usually follows American actions like this, at least for a few weeks or months, you'll have to wait until the disaster of all this happens. Mr. Macron in France, a weak political leader, has already had to distance himself. Even the British, half of whom refer to their own leaders as America's poodle. Tony Blair earned that accolade. Even Mr. Johnson found it impossible to endorse the killing of that general. Wow. Wow. You will now see many, many parts of the world looking upon the United States over the last 3 years, having suddenly imposed tariffs on world trade, having suddenly changed its attitude towards immigrants into becoming a kind of a hateful rejecter, having spurned allies, having dropped out of the Paris Agreement around ecology and climate change, now showing that for the economics of electoral re-election programs, we are also now a nation that will find a diplomat somewhere that's convenient and symbolically attractive and kill him with a few others. Because of what? What does it affect? What do you think is going to come out of this that makes it justifiable to do such a thing? Well, the rest of the world looks in total disbelief. Once again, I think I've told you this in the past, once again, I'm finding myself getting emails from people I know in Europe reminding me that if it's becoming unlivable where you are, we have a nice apartment in the back where you and your family will be safe. It's not that they understand what's going on here, but it gives you an idea of how it looks out there, what we are doing. You ought to think about it. All right, quickly. Bloomberg, the man who is apparently running for something, And those of you who watch the Super Bowl will see an ad he purchased yesterday for $10 million during the Super Bowl. About 14 minutes after he purchased the $10 million ad, the equivalent ad for also $10 million was purchased by the Trump organization. So if you watch the Super Bowl, you will see an ad for one billionaire against an ad for another billionaire, and in between the two will be a picture of the American flag. I can't make more comments. Bloomberg News, which is a very important and pretty good source of financial news, carried an article today about economics. This is a little touchy. I don't mean to pick out the Catholic Church, but it's about the Catholic Church. And what I'm about to tell you is true of other churches too. But this is a story about the Catholic Church. And if you're interested, get today's Bloomberg and you can read it. In that is a story of how the Catholic Church here in the United States has been using the bankruptcy laws in the United States to go bankrupt. Diocese after diocese across the United States is declaring bankruptcy. They've added up, Bloomberg did all this research, they've added it up, and the church has now shielded, by using bankruptcy, roughly $2 billion of wealth, because using bankruptcy allowed them to put that wealth out of the diocese and into the ownership of the particular parish within the diocese, and therefore the suits of the families whose kids were molested by pedophiles that you all know about can't get at that money because it's protected, since it isn't the diocese's property, because the diocese moved it into the parishes as part of the bankruptcy. The details are in the Bloomberg article. But I really have to, it's who I am, and so I have to do this. When there's a struggle between religion and theology and the morality of religion on the one hand, and cold, hard cash on the other, I leave it to you to figure out who wins in that conflict. The church has hidden $2 billion so that it can't be distributed among the young people and the families of folks who were traumatized by being assaulted, men and women, as children in and by the church. Last thing, quick one. I'll do it now rather than later. When I was growing up, I drank milk because my family thought it was good to drink milk, the old days before we were told not to drink milk. And the milk we drank was always produced by something called the Borden Company. And I remember as a kid, because they had a kind of a logo with Elsie the cow. Some of you may remember Elsie the cow. Well, Elsie went bankrupt this last week. Second major dairy company to go bankrupt in the United States. And the explanation of the CEO I thought was stunning. Because he basically said, what did us in was debt. Now, the way he wrote it, you could be forgiven for believing that debt was some kind of bad thing that fell from the sky and really messed up the milk truck. The idea that the way you get debt is when you take out a loan, which is what they did too much of. And so now that the milk business was in trouble, as Americans don't want milk from a cow, they want milk from oats. I have to be careful here. And from other plant-based, I believe that's the language, right? Plant-based sources. So the poor milk producers have nowhere to go, and nobody wants the stuff anymore. And when you have loaded up on debt and you can't sell milk, it means you can't pay back your debt, you're dead. Okay? It's a sign that there's a debt problem that I'm going to come back to in a couple of minutes. And the last one is General Motors, which announced this morning that it's in tough shape. Some of you may remember in 2008 and 9, General Motors basically collapsed, went into bankruptcy, had to get a $50 billion gift from the United States some of which it paid back, not all of which. So I want you to understand that GM has been doing real well thanks to all the money you gave it. You may not have known it, which is the way this thing is usually arranged, but nonetheless, you did that. And now they're in trouble again. Only this time they're in trouble for a different reason. They bet the farm, all of it, on surviving in an American economy that wasn't buying cars the way it was in the past and isn't buying cars from the American companies the way it used to. So they decided to put all of their effort, poor company, on becoming the biggest producer and seller of cars in and to the People's Republic of China, where they are the number 2 foreign car producer after Volkswagen, which is the number 1 foreign car producer in China. Over the last 2 years, the Chinese are not buying GM cars. How strange. How strange. And they're now in deep doo-doo because they have big loans, like Borden, and they can't sell cars, which means only they're much, much larger than Borden, so the effect of their difficulties, well, you'll all find out in the weeks and months ahead. But don't worry, you won't hear about it from this government or from these media. Last thing before we jump into the main topic. I promised you to say a few words about what's going on in France and in England, because these are very important shapers of the modern world, including what happens here in the United States. First, because I know a good part of what I say here is, how shall I say, not uplifting news. It's news that makes you worry about your survival. The news in France is different. France, which is a special country and has been for at least 2 centuries, France is striking in all the senses of the word. There's a striking situation and there are a lot of people on strike. It is sometimes referred to as a general strike. That's not quite accurate. It isn't general in the sense that everybody is going out. It's not. But it is an absolutely remarkable strike coming after a remarkable year. For over a year, you've had a non-unionized upsurge of popular radicalism called the Yellow Vest movement. I'm sure many of you have seen it. It is still going on, not at the scale it once did, but it's now over a year old. For those of you who have ever tried to sustain a political movement that involves demonstrations week after week, you know what an achievement it is to keep such a thing going for a year, or over a year now. Extraordinary. So France already extraordinary. Then on the 5th of December, by the way, Mr. Macron, the leader, tried everything he could to stop the Yellow Vest movement and basically failed. By the way, including getting rid of the tax increase on fuel that started the whole thing off a little over a year ago. He gave in on that early on. By that time, it was too late. The demonstrators had gone on to demand not just the removal of those taxes, but the removal of Mr. Macron, which he didn't feel like doing. On December 5th, so a little over a month ago, the labor movement decided, heavily influenced by what they saw in the Yellow Vest movement, they decided to say to Mr. Macron that the second big act of his leadership was unacceptable. That act was to change the pension system in France. In France, almost everybody gets a pension, but there are 40 or 50, 42, I believe, different pension systems that have been developed over the years. This one is regional, that one has only this industry in it, and so on. And Mr. Macron used a very old political ploy. That's too many, 40, it's confusing. I am going to update it and restructure it. But when you read the fine print, the updating and the restructuring happened just by accident to also reduce the pension benefits that the French people could get, with the biggest single method of reduction being the extension of the years. You wouldn't become eligible, I'm trying to remember the exact years, I think 62 to 64, that's right. Instead of being eligible for retirement at 62, you would have to wait till you're 64, something like that. But of course, since you've been pumping money in, you have to wait that there's less pension. And by the way, this is often your money that you put away that they're now not going to give you. Okay, so the French unions, who had not been part of the Yellow Vest operation, decided this was unacceptable. There are 4 union associations of unions, big ones, federations of unions in France, and 3 of them got together and said, no, you're not going to do this. The French like this kind of activity. They like it as much as Americans seem not to. Why that is, I leave to your imagination. I don't know. And so they went and they said, we're going to go on strike about it. And one union didn't go along, but fortunately, Mr. Macron's utter incapacity to understand any of this led him to make statements which got that 4th union, which is the most moderate, also to join. So by the time things hit, within a day or two of the start on the 5th of December, all the 4 unions were together saying, we will not allow this pension reform to go through. And they have been on strike now since December 5th without interruption. They chose as their major focus the rail transportation system in France. That means the metro, which is their subway in Paris, the RER, which is the suburban feeder rail system into Paris, and a variety of other of the rail system, the SNCF as it's called in France. And that system has been badly compromised, literally, to this moment that we are speaking. A huge demonstration has already happened several times. The next one is scheduled for tomorrow. So you can expect, those of you that are interested in the media, check tomorrow. By the time you get up, which it's 6 hours later there, will be underway in France. This is the longest rail strike in the history of France. This rail system dates back to around the 1930s or earlier, but the modern one is the 1930s. They've never had a strike lasting this long. In the early days of the strike, the public polling indicated a support of 56% of the French population polled. It has gone down a bit. It's now in the middle to high 40s. But this is a strike that has discombobulated transportation in that country for both the Christmas and New Year holiday period, which is probably a maximum travel time. To hold on to that part of the population, despite the inconvenience and despite the endless focus of the mass media on the inconvenience as a way to undercut support for the thing, is really extraordinary. There are 2 big demonstrations coming, one on the 9th, one on the 11th. It's mostly concentrated in Paris. France, if you know that country, is it's not that big a country, but Paris is its political, cultural, and virtually every other kind of center, so it's understandable. And the Yellow Vest was actually a bit more of the countryside than it was Paris, so it kind of balanced it. Yellow Vests have joined the unions who've welcomed them to march with them. Students have joined, and here's something for you to think about. So have students from the university and the police have struck also in solidarity with them. Here's a clue to you. When there's a big strike and you don't like the government and the police join you, it's over. Now, it isn't yet in France because it takes time and the police waffle, but it's extraordinary. And Mr. Macron, you have to admire him. Well, I wouldn't go that far. He keeps talking like he was the leader of something, that he was the unifier of something. He can't unify a paper bag. He is what in America would be called a really big loser. of everything that he has tried to do. But remember, he only won an election, the first round of that presidential election, by 2%. He got 21% of that vote. Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the left-wing candidate, got 19%. That was a difference. And under the French law, the top two run again. That was him and Le Pen, the right-wing quasi-fascistic. Nobody's going to vote. 20% of France will vote, which is serious enough, but that's it. And therefore, of course, he would win, just as Mr. Mélenchon, if it had been 2% different, would have been the leader now. So it's very important to understand mass uprisings in France. That's what this is. Now over a year and a quarter of mass uprisings that have changed the law, stopped the government, reversed policy. Notice what can be done if masses of people are mobilized and organized. The unions bring to these things really well-heeled organization. They are joined by the old leftist parties. Unions in France are very associated with those parties anyway and have been for a long time. Now the Yellow Vests, having a year of experience, they know how to do this. You've got a well-oiled, well-organized, self-conscious, mobilized mass of people, and they are making big changes. I urge those of you watching and those of you here to think about that and ask yourself under what conditions it might be transferred beyond the borders of France. The French Revolution in 1789, as you probably know from your history, transferred very nicely beyond France. Europe was never the same. There's no reason why that can't happen again. Across the English Channel, however, the story is a bit different. Britain. In Britain, the Labour Party, their left wing, their second party, suffered a catastrophic defeat since we last were in this room. Jeremy Corbyn, who's best probably understood as a kind of Bernie Sanders over there, announced that he would no longer be the leader of the party as his acknowledgement that they were badly defeated in the polls. What? Okay, yes. Boris Johnson is the new head of the... he refers to himself as the Trump of Great Britain. So you can do with that whatever you want. He is a bad boy who says things like Trump does a lot. And he is now really in charge because he got a big majority in the parliament because of the defeat of the Labour Party. The Labour Party is now going through an internal search for who will replace Corbyn. There's, I think, 8 or 9 candidates, men and women, that come from the different wings of the Labour Party. And that will be fought out over the next few weeks. I wanted to say a few words to you about that defeat and what it represents, because the economics there are also very important. Britain has been, in many ways, a lesson that others around the world, particularly Americans, have worked really hard not to learn. Now, let's remember Britain. In the 18th and 19th century, the British Empire ruled the world. The British loved to say that the sun never sets on Britain because there's always some part of the world that's in the sun, and Britain has that part. But try to think a little bit. What is Britain? It is a small, wet island off the mainland of Europe. That's what it is. Okay? It became the empire that ruled the world. That is really a tiny little corner, able for a short time to be a global empire. It's extraordinary. But what happened in Britain, which is the lesson, is what had happened to every empire. The Roman, the Dutch, all the ones, the Greeks, all that you can look at. They made money off their empire. They made their empire pay. The British policy was to take a colony and make sure that the colony paid whatever the costs Britain had to get it, to take it, and to administer it. One of the reasons Kenya produces coffee and Uganda produces cotton and Egypt produces cotton is because the British, who got there and took these places, put those crops there because that was profitable for them to do it. Those were not crops in many of these countries that ever grew there before. That was the empire that was making these decisions, thereby condemning these people to be coffee farmers or cotton farmers, etc., etc. And it worked. Britain was a fantastic empire. But as it developed these countries, sooner or later, these countries began, as they developed their merchants and their producers, they began to have an idea, we want to do things our own way. And we don't want to be ripped off by the British all the time. We would like to, I'm talking to Americans. One of the places this happened most dramatically was here. We were a British colony until we didn't want to be anymore. And then we made I know this will come as a shock, a violent revolution against the British. We took up arms. We killed them in sizable numbers. And to everybody's surprise, we defeated them. But they didn't give up. They didn't get the lesson either. So in 1812, which wasn't that many years later, they tried again. And we had the War of 1812, where the British were defeated again. Then they gave up. 2 was enough. And by that time, they were having trouble from other parts of their empire, like India and so forth. So the British changed their approach. They tried to hold on to certain advantages, but it didn't really work. They toyed, I assume most of you know, they toyed during the American Civil War of cutting a deal with the South in order to reestablish a dominant control here, especially because their empire was built on cotton textiles, and cotton came from the American South, nowhere else in the United States. Anyway, it didn't work. And what do we have? By the beginning of the 20th century, the British Empire is over. Then over the last 100 years, we have a grand historical reversal. The colonizer becomes the colony, and the colony becomes the colonizer. They reverse places. Across that time, the British said, you Americans, you're cheating. You're stealing our intellectual property. They didn't use those words, but that's what they meant. You're taking our trademarks. You're copying what we know how to. You're cheating. I hope this sounds familiar. Did it work? These attacks, these denunciations? No. Britain is now really, with Brexit, going back to what it was, a small, wet, offshore island of Europe. What's the lesson here? The lesson here is what we, the United States, is trying to do to China has exactly the same profile coming down the pike. And the only question is it going to take a war under modern circumstances to teach that lesson? Or maybe human beings could learn that you better live with, because the mark of what's going on in the world, as I'm going to say to you in a few minutes, is that this story is being replayed with the role of England and Britain now being taken by the United States. And all the British can do is gurgle into their pints and watch the process with a certain Schadenfreude, the Germans would say. Okay. The 3 key economic issues of 2020 here in the United States. The first one, the so-called great economy. Mr. Trump says the economy is great. He says it almost every day. The Republican Party echoes him, as they do virtually everything he says, also every day. That might not be much of a surprise. He's the incumbent. He needs the economy to be thought of as great because he's running on that. He hopes to be reelected. What is disheartening for folks like me is to see how many Democrats say that too, feel they have to also kind of go along, and how many of the major media feel also that they have to go along with some statement that the American economy is in great shape and so forth. So let me tell you a story and then illustrate it. Having gone to these elite universities, I have friends from graduate school, from my life as a professor, that include people on the right and people in the middle, as well as people on the left like me. And periodically we get together and we have a cup of coffee or a drink somewhere and we talk about our different perspectives. We don't agree on how the United States got into its current situation, and we don't agree on how you ought to get out of it. But we are all kind of struck over the last 2 or 3 or 4 by now years with something we do agree on, which surprises us all. And it can be summarized in this statement: this is the worst condition of the American economy in our lifetimes. As I said, these are right-wingers, center people, and left people. So how would I explain this peculiar difference that you see? And again, there's many ways, but I'm going to just pick a few to try to get the point home to you. During 2019, something remarkable happened that you may not have noticed if you don't pay attention to these sorts of things. In the years since the crash of 2008 and 9, the United States government, led by both the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, were so frightened that the crash of 2008 and 9 would bring a general depression, kind of like the crash of 1929 brought in the 1930s, that they took extraordinary steps, which you will remember, to prevent that from happening. For example, Mr. Obama, early in his administration, got passage by Republicans and Democrats of an $800 billion stimulus program. You may remember that's an enormous government spending program, basically, of really extraordinary size. At the same time, the Federal Reserve began pumping historically unprecedented amounts of money into the economy. Not only printing it and distributing it, but dropping interest rates so that everybody who's in a borrowing mood now has virtually free money, even to the point, which we hadn't had before, of negative interest rates. Some of you have read about that in our economy and around the world, there are many trillions of dollars being lent such that you give back at the end of the loan less than you took out. That's a negative interest rate built into the loan. These are enormous stimuli. This is the equivalent of somebody so badly injured in a car wreck that they're on every kind of life support there is. You know, tubes are coming into them. Everything is being done to keep them from what otherwise would happen, which is they would die. Okay? So we did that. We did that. Boy, did we do that. Well, this had consequences. When you pump all that kind of money in, and when you stimulate the economy, when the government comes rushing in with huge amounts of money to spend, at the same time that everybody who wants to borrow borrows money and pumps that into economy, you have an economy in which suddenly there's a kind of think of it this way, a wall of money spending coming at you. Now, in a private capitalist economy where we allow private enterprises to do whatever they want, every business has a moment of truth. How are we, in the shoemaker or the bread baker or the car producer, how are we going to react to all of this extra purchasing power that's now in the economy thanks to the stimulus program of the Treasury and to the money increasing program of the Federal Reserve? And every business makes a choice. You can do one of two things. Seeing all that money coming, you can order more stuff so that you can sell it to the people who have all the extra money. And that's kind of what we as economists want, because that puts people to work, that gives people jobs, making all the extra stuff that the businessman or woman is going to sell to people who have all this extra purchasing power. But of course, a business has a second option. It can choose not to get more stuff. It can choose to raise the price of what it already sells. And you know, that's a lot more attractive. You don't have to spend a lot of time calling the factory to get more stuff made. You don't have to arrange for the transportation. You don't have to arrange for the storage or putting it on the shelf. You can make just as much more profit just by raising the price of everything. And if you do that, it's called then inflation. Prices go up. That's not, by the way, and inflation, therefore, isn't a mystery or isn't complicated. It's a product of, capitalism. That's how it works. If you didn't allow private enterprises to determine prices, if prices were set as part of a rational plan, well, you wouldn't have this problem, because then you could increase the money supply and businesses wouldn't be allowed to raise prices, in which case they have really only one way to make more money, get more goods, which is what we want. By the way, do capitalists ever do what I just said? Yes. Did they ever do it in the United States? Yes. Who did it? You ready? Nixon did it. Remember Nixon? He was even more attractive than Trump. In 1971, Nixon said, "We've got a terrible inflation." We did. So what Nixon did is he said, "I'm going to pump money into the economy, but I'm not going to allow businesses to raise the price, because that way I can make sure that the money we're pumping in is used to produce more goods, hiring more people." And so what Mr. Nixon did on August 15th, 1971, he declared a wage price freeze. Go look it up. You'll do the history. Some of you here were alive way back then. Okay? And here's what Mr. Nixon, a Republican conservative, here's what he did. All prices, as of tomorrow morning, I kid you not, as of tomorrow morning, all prices are frozen. If you're a business and you raise the price, we're going to arrest you and put you in jail. So I advise you, don't do it. You know how you stop an inflation? Mr. Nixon knew. Is that a problem? Not at all. How long does it take? Overnight. The next time you hear, you're inflated, the risk of inflation, what? That's a political issue, that's all. There's no technical problem, there's no economic problem. And if you hear someone say that to you, talk to somebody else, because you're being hustled. The next thing is they're going to sell you a major interest in the Brooklyn Bridge. So what happened with all this money? Did we have an inflation? No. And here's why. The money, when you pump it in, goes first into the hands of banks and big corporations. They didn't want to spend that money increasing production. Why? Because nobody can buy anything in America. The inequality that has been getting worse and worse for 30 to 40 years means that the mass of people don't have money to spend. They didn't have it already in the 70s and 80s, but they were able to keep spending by, you know what, borrowing. That's what you all did. Mortgages, car loans, credit cards, and college loans. The four ways to plunge the American people into a debt mess they have no way to get out of. But you run out. 2008 showed us you can't keep having more debt if your underlying wage isn't going anywhere, which it wasn't. So where did all the money go? It didn't go into producing goods. It didn't go into buying goods. It went into another place where people with a lot of, there we go. It went into the stock market, where the inflation is spectacular over the last 8. No mystery, we have an inflation. It's just not where you're sitting. You don't have to pay higher prices, that's the good news, and you don't get higher incomes, that's the bad news. Unless you happen to have stocks, in which case, whoosh, they went off the chart. And 2019 was exceptionally good that way. 27% increase in the stock market in 1 year, very nice. If you are a person who has a lot of stock, your wealth went up by 29%. I won't embarrass you by asking you to look into your own financial situation and ask whether your finances went up by 29% over last year. That's a third in 1 year, third more wealth. So who's happy in this economy? People in the stock market, right? The top 5% of people in the stock market own all the stocks that matter. I know you own 6 shares of something your grandmother left you, but we all know what that means. It's very pleasurable to look at, but it doesn't count in your finances, does it? And for most of you, that's true of your pensions as well. The stocks are owned by so a tiny number of people did really well. That tiny number are the people who own the newspapers, who own the television stations, and they're the ones who are celebrating a great economy because for them, it was. But that's not a great economy for the people. That's a great economy for a very small minority of the people. Number 2, unemployment. You've been told, because that's the only other statistic Mr. Trump has. He has the stock market and he has unemployment. After that, he runs out. By the way, to measure the health of an economy by looking at 2 indices is the equivalent of your saying you feel really bad, going to a doctor, and the doctor takes your temperature and checks out the distance between your second and third toe. Those are 2 indices, and they're interesting. But if it was a doctor, that's what he did, and he told you you were healthy on that basis, you know what you would do is get another doctor, because this is an idiot. A president or a party that tells you there are 2 wonderful statistics, the unemployment rate and the stock market, and doesn't tell you about anything else, you shouldn't listen to them for 5 minutes, because that's stupid. But of course not really, it's just a way of focusing you on the only thing they have that looks good. Let's take a look at unemployment. It is lower than it has been before, but I want to remind you, because I know this is a bit of a technical thing, unemployment is measured basically in the United States in the following way. Questions are asked. Random people are selected, and they're asked a question. Are you working? If you answer yes, I'm working, you're counted as an employed person. If you answer no, I'm not working, you are asked the second question. Are you looking for work? If you answer yes, you're considered unemployed. If you answer no, I'm not looking, you are not considered to be part of the labor force and you're not counted at all. Which means if in 1 month there are, let's say, 1 million people that say, I'm looking for a work, but the next month when they're asked, they say, I've given up. There is no work, I'm not looking anymore. The unemployment rate will collapse because they're not anymore looking. But this isn't because the economy is great, it's the opposite. It's the economy is so poor that we measure that. It's called the labor force participation rate. It's the percentage of people in working age who are either working or looking for work. And we are lower now than we were 5 years ago. So part of the unemployment improvement isn't an improvement, it's a deterioration because people have given up. Young people who decide to go to school figuring I'll get a more credential and I'll have a better shot. Poor folks that they are who think like that. Or old people who give up. Or people who decide they can do better in the illegal economy than they can in the... I'm sure there's nobody in this room who could imagine such a thing, but there are people like that, millions of them, and more each day because the illegal is a better shot for income in many cases than the legal. So this unemployment number is a mirage, and even if it were true, it's just part of the story. I'm going to give you some other statistics to look at, just to give you an idea. A recent study that I produce in the Twitters and memes that we send out from Democracy at Work. A recent study of an association here in the United States indicated that people over 65 who live alone, so this is mostly women because of women living longer than men anyway. People in the United States over 65 living alone, 50% of them, ready, have insufficient income for minimal subsistence. 50% of people over 65 who are living in a couple, they're both around, the number is 23%. So roughly a quarter of our older people in couples and half of our older people living alone are economically insecure. They can't make it. And that takes into account Social Security and whatever else they have. What kind of an economy is great that has the statistics like that? Let me give you another. Well, I gave you two already. General Motors in China, that's a very serious problem coming down. Borden, the milk, a very serious debt problem. Now I want to talk about debt. And this is a wonderful example of the craziness that capitalism is. This system which, when we're all dead, 200 years from now, people will look back on this system and say, what was wrong with the people who lived like that? It's like when some of us read, I don't know, about medieval, I'm going to pick a country, Albania, and then you read stories of good religious people beating themselves over the back. Remember, you know those stories, the flagellation with twigs to beat the sinfulness out of themselves. I don't mean to upset anyone who's still engaged in that sort of thing. We don't do that physically. We use mental mechanisms to achieve the same effect. Anyway, we wonder to ourselves, gee, whoa, what did people do like that? Well, they're going to look back at us, and here's what they're going to see. Capitalism crashes in 2008 and 9, as I've already told you. And because of the anxiety that it becomes a general depression and all that that would mean, the Federal Reserve comes in and drops interest rates drastically to zero, or as I said, even sometimes to negative. Well, what does that do? Well, it's a wonderful signal to every possible person, every business, every individual, every government. You now have an opportunity you've never had before. You can get free money, money you don't have to pay any interest for. If you have a problem in your business, go borrow some free money. It's an easier way of solving it than all the other options you have to solve your problem. Every government that doesn't know, for example, all those governments that were stimulating their economy, they didn't want to tax people to get that stimulus going. That would have been self-defeating. So they borrowed the money. Why? Because the interest rate's so cheap. Of course we can do this. So everybody borrowed to solve whatever economic problem they had. Big business, small business, medium, big government, local government, regional government, individuals, you, me, all of us. A generation of young people looking at a job market that really stinks, went to schools that they might otherwise not have gone to, and they couldn't afford it. So they borrowed the money to get the degree, to get through the school, in a desperate hope not to be left out of a declining economy that isn't great. If it were great, you wouldn't be so desperate. So everybody borrowed. You know what that means? It means that today, governments, corporations, and the people are having levels of debt we've never seen before in the modern world. No one has ever seen this. And you know what that means? It means that when there's a downturn, which capitalism has every 47 years on average, for the last 200 years, without exception. That's an average, so it varies, but downturns, now the downturn is going to have a whole new quality. It doesn't just mean company A goes out of business, because company A is up to here in debt, which means when it goes out of business, it can't pay back the loans to whoever lent it money, who is now going to be dragged down by the downturn. Even if the downturn happened over here in milk, you're a bank over there who lent to the milk company, and you're dead because they can't pay you back. We have no idea how to manage that. We've never been in that situation. An economy leveled up, or leveraged as we call it, with debt like this, is an economy that isn't great. It's an economy that's very vulnerable in a very dangerous way. I could go on, but I think the point is made. To call this economy great is a pure political ploy designed to get him reelected, which is what the assassination of that general in Iraq was too. It's the same issue. Next, why is capitalism now struggling between tariffs, trade wars, and all of that? This is a very important issue which is now going to become well known. It's been a bit below the surface for a while, but it will now emerge. Capitalism has always had this kind of problem. On the one hand, in every capitalist economy, like the United States, there are businesses that want free trade. They want the world to be open so that they can produce whatever they want to produce over here, where it's cheapest to produce it, ship it over there to store it, and then move it over there to sell it. They want freedom to move and get the best price for their inputs and the best price for their outputs. It's like General Motors that wants to produce cars in China for the Chinese market. It's Pepsi-Cola, which makes more profit from the soda pop it produces outside the United States than what it does inside, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those companies want free trade. But then there are a whole other bunch of companies that don't want it. Why? Because they suffer from the ability of other countries to produce stuff more profitably and bring it here. They want, ready? Protection. That's what it's called. Protection economics. They want a barrier, a tariff. Let me give you an example. Sometime over the next 3 or 4 days, the United States and France will reach an agreement, or not, about the tariffs Mr. Trump wants to impose. By the way, for some of you, this may be an important piece of information on French cheese and French wine and French brandy and all the rest of it. Why? Well, it's part of Mr. Trump's demonstration that he's tough and not letting the French people cheat us and all of that boring rhetoric. But here's the people who like this. Napa Valley. Because if there's a tariff of 25% on French wine, that's the price. When you go to the liquor store, the French wine section of the liquor store, those prices are going to go up because that liquor store has to pay part of the cost of this tariff. The wines from Napa don't go up there. They're not subject to the tariff. So this is a way of shifting the business from the French wine or the Italian wine or the Australian wine or wherever the tariffs are hit to the American alternative. It gets even more complicated because if you do it to the French but you don't do it to the Italians, well then it hurts France. Its exports to America drop, but the Italians don't mind because they're exempted from it. So now we get an immense amount, ready, of political horse trading. Everybody is fighting to have a tariff or to not have a tariff. If a tariff is passed, to get an exemption from the tariff. It's an endless process of stuff. That's all this is. Don't be fooled by endless claims, tariffs will help America. That is, I'm going to use a technical term in economics, bullshit. Okay? What it is, it hurts certain capitalists if you raise a tariff. It hurts other capitalists if you lower. The ones who benefit from lowering want it lowered, and their lobbyists are busy in Washington and everywhere getting that. And the outcome depends on who's got more money to hire how many lobbyists to win. That's what the outcome is. It has nothing to do with efficiency, nothing to do with America. Nobody cares. It's irrelevant. This is a fight between two groups of capitalists. That's what it always was. But the winners and the losers will change the economic environment we live in. You can see an explosion of wine being produced in America if you block the wines from Europe, or you cannot. Or you cannot. Same thing with automobiles, because the tariffs, Mr. Trump is talking about putting tariffs on European automobiles coming here. Tariffs have already changed. Let me give you one example, just so you see. In 1963, long time ago, the United States imposed a tariff on European trucks, not cars, trucks, light trucks. It's a long story. It had to do with a fight over chicken produced in the United States that they wanted to sell in Europe. The Europeans would have none of it. They wouldn't allow the chickens. They still don't allow chickens. You all know about the chickens. In the United States, chickens are washed with chlorine. Every time you eat a piece of chicken, you are eating chlorine. In America, that is thought of as very sanitary. The Europeans look upon that as barbaric. So they don't allow the chicken, right? Which is one of the reasons we have so much chicken and it's so cheap, because we can't give that crap away. Okay? In retaliation, this is the truth, I didn't make this stuff up. You couldn't, I haven't imagination. In retaliation for the Europeans on chicken, just to give you an idea of how this works, the United States put a tariff on light trucks. Suddenly, at 25%, a big one. So suddenly, the American car producers, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, faced a new situation. This was delicious. They now could produce trucks which before they couldn't give away because the Europeans were producing better trucks at a lower price. Now the Europeans were screwed because even though they produced, let's say, a truck at 10% less, with a 25% tariff, they were now more expensive even though they were more efficient. Notice, efficiency counted for nothing. Only in the minds of economists is efficiency a very important matter. But in the real world, it's as important as the number of pennies that fell into your shoe on the way over here. You don't care. So what did General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler do? They said, we can make more money on the pickup truck, the light truck, than we can on cars, which means we are now going to persuade the American people that the manly thing is to have a truck. You're not a real, the women they gave up on. The women in those days didn't buy trucks, didn't buy cars. That was a man thing to do. So you went after the men and you had an image, remember in the magazine, of a very tough guy with boots and he was climbing into his truck. Americans buy an ungodly number of these absurdly useless trucks. Why? Because we love the truck. Oh, come on, don't be naive. You had to be taught that there's something, ready? It's not easy, that there's something sexy about a truck. You realize how impoverished your sexuality has to be to get you going on a truck? Think about it. We produced a culture of the truck, of the pickup truck, as a somehow, people have to have it. People have nothing, who never take anything anywhere. And what they do take could fit in the trunk of a regular sedan, but they have to have a truck. They don't feel like they're a full male without a truck. That's not a product of some peculiarity of American culture or some peculiarity of masculinity. That's a product of a tariff. That's how tariffs shape a society. We are obsessed with trucks for no other reason than that we have imposed, by the way, we've imposed that. The same General Motors who doesn't want Trump to put tariffs now because the Chinese will retaliate and block them from getting into China, don't want anyone to touch the 25% tariff on trucks that they have profited from for the last half century. The lying, the duplicity, the fakery, it's as thick as any milkshake you ever had. Okay? Don't be fooled. This issue of tariffs and trade war is a fight between two kinds of enterprises. Yes, it's also a game for politicians because politicians know that if they start talking, like Mr. Trump, if they start talking about tariffs, they're going to get very big donations from whoever wants the tariff to go up and whoever wants it to go down. They will collect and then make their excuses. Oh, I was hoping to get it down. I really appreciate the $400 million you gave me, but I couldn't get it done because of Mitch McConnell. Make something up. But it's a good ploy for politicians to get donations for what otherwise it has nothing to do with anything to do with efficiency or anything else. It's not about national interest. It's a fight between two groups of capitalists, and they have to line us up in order to get the votes in Congress for what they want. So they appeal to the public by telling us fake stories about how we should be interested in whether the tariff is high or low. Last thing, China. Well, I think I've done that already, right? China is what the United States was. It's the up-and-coming economy. There is no way around that. You can jump up and down all you want. The rate of growth of the Chinese economy is a runaway dominant over the United States. This is the lowest rate of growth the Chinese have had in many years. It's roughly 6%. Our rate of growth this year, the United States, will be 2.5%. Do you understand? They're growing at 3 times the rate, and they have been growing at 3 times the rate for 30 years. That's why they caught up. And that's why they will surpass the United States as an economic unit within the next 10 years. And there's nothing Mr. Trump can do about it. He tried with his tariffs, didn't work. He tried with the trade war, it didn't work. He can't do it any more than he can control Iraq with his army and 17 years of occupation. He can't do, and that's very frustrating. I understand it. If I were in his shoes, I'd be very frustrated too. I might be so frustrated I would go assassinate a general someplace in order to look as though I'm doing something. But he can't. But he is a master at looking at something that will look as though. And here's what China allowed him to do. He figured he could look like he's really beating up on the Chinese. So he hit them with a bunch of tariffs. The Chinese, very smart people, hit back with a bunch of tariffs. Suddenly, the farmers in the Midwest who produce soybeans and other crops couldn't sell them to China, which is where they've been selling them all. The Chinese arranged to get them from Brazil and other parts of the world, and the United States farmers suddenly began to think that Mr. Trump wasn't the incarnation of Jesus Christ, but he was the incarnation of somebody from a lower origins, right? So that becomes dangerous from him. That becomes dangerous politically, which is why you will see next week the signing of a little agreement between the Chinese delegation coming here and Mr. Trump or Mr. Lighthizer, who's his trade representative. That's done for domestic political reasons, like most of this is. So Mr. Trump had to back down, but then of course he doesn't look like he's finally making a deal with and he will claim a great victory. Like he claimed today that the Iraqis stood down when they sent those missiles, the Iranians sent those missiles. He'll pretend a big victory, but the Americans are not that dumb. So what is he going to do? He found a way, and you're going to see a lot of it. He found a Chinese company. He knew it was Chinese because it had a name that looks Chinese. It's called Huawei. Some of you may know this company because it's the world leader in 5G technology and all of that. So he is beating up on Huawei. He arranged for the arrest of a woman executive in Canada. Some of you know that last year. So she's still in house arrest in Vancouver or someplace where they're keeping her, the Canadians. And he is denying them. He's trying to use everything he can to get a maximum headlines. I am whacking Huawei. He even got the poor, pathetic Boris Johnson and told him that now that Brexit is reducing Britain to, really, the pits, he's going to punish them if they cut a deal with Huawei, which the British want to do. What will he do? The Americans will not share intelligence with the British. Given our intelligence, I don't understand why this is a threat, but that's another matter. It seems that the British do, which may tell you something about them. Great economy we don't have. Defeating China is not in the playbook. So for the United States, it's like what it was for Britain with America. You're going to go to war, you're going to have a revolution, you're going to have another war to try to stop what doesn't work, or you're going to recognize you better work out some accommodation here because the alternative really isn't available. It's very important to understand this. Now to leave you with one final note, a bit of a scare. This is a desperate government that we have, if you hadn't noticed it, but it's also an economy that's in tough shape. Mr. Trump is not the origin of most of what he does. He's a symptom. He's not the problem. He's acting out under the pressures he has to try to win an election that's difficult while being impeached. That's a tough game. He's doing the best he can to distract, but the real underlying problems are an economy that is in the kind of shape we're talking about, that has postponed its reckoning with its problems by a mountain of debt that it does not know how to control, and a blindness, a self-blindness that really needs psychiatric help. We are a society, we could solve these problems, but you have to admit you have them. It's like the old AA. If you're going to work with AA, you got to begin by going in there and saying, I'm an alcoholic, I have a problem, and then we can start working on how to help you and how to get you out of that mess. But we can't help you if you pretend to yourself that you don't have this problem. This is a country led by Mr. Trump who needs to set to itself, everything's fine, with the greatest economy. It's pathetic. Just like assassinating some general is a sign of weakness, of desperation, not a sign of you're a tough guy. It's childish. And the results have already been very bad for the United States. But again, the pretense, it's all a tough success. That's what I want to leave you with, thinking about that as you read the headlines. Remember, a month from now, Harriet Fraud and Juliana Forlano on the family and capitalism and intimate relationships.